My brother was told by my parents to take my house away from me because I have no family. My parents decided that my sister should take over my residence because I don't have a family of my own. I am an unmarried man in my early 30s. My sister is 29 and already has 4 children. She had her first at 22, the second a year later, the third arrived 2 years after that, and the fourth was born just a few months ago. Her husband and I clash often. He constantly tries to provoke me by acting superior, and then dramatically plays the victim if I react. He can shed tears on command, and puts on a highly convincing performance to gain sympathy from nearly anyone. My parents and sister dote on him, fully aware of his true nature but simply choosing to ignore it. Admittedly, he is quite attractive, but his personality is so repulsive that I could never be drawn to him. He also refuses to seek employment despite having a college degree, and my mother eagerly helps with the children all day, so their entire financial situation rests on my sister. This situation means they can't afford to live anywhere other than my parents' home, and privacy is scarce with all of them under one roof in a 3-bedroom house built in the 1960s. When we were growing up, my younger sister was clearly the favored child. There are 3 years between us, but she developed a sense of superiority because I was severely punished if I retaliated against her behavior. It was evident that my parents favored her, as she received the majority of everything unless others called them out on it, which did happen occasionally. This favoritism is why my parents relocated us about 150 miles away from our extended family, so we generally only saw them during holidays since it was a 3-hour drive. My sister was physically abusive towards me multiple times, relentlessly flirted with my first girlfriend until she broke up with me, and found amusement in my misfortunes. My parents always told me to toughen up whenever I expressed my distress. I only received equal treatment when my parents needed to maintain appearances. I found it somewhat amusing to see their expressions whenever they had to treat me equally to my sister on birthdays and Christmas in front of others. We had relatives who were extremely nosy and loved gossiping about family drama, so my parents did everything they could to conceal the reality and threatened to take away all my belongings if I didn't stay quiet. If anything, it made my parents even more pleased when I turned 18 and moved out because they no longer had to support me. I hadn't even finished high school when I left, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. I maintained minimal contact after leaving home. They didn't attend my high school graduation, but I wasn't bothered by it. From that point on, I only saw my parents and sister during holidays, just like the rest of the family. The start of the 2020 pandemic was particularly harsh on me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the rent with unemployment benefits. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I was very fond of. As the lease ended, my roommate moved out early to stay with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my possessions to avoid homelessness by downsizing drastically. I realize now that I shouldn't have rented such an expensive place, but I enjoyed living lavishly until circumstances changed. It made me understand that I should have chosen a much cheaper living situation to save more money. I had no fallback option, but I devised a strategy. I've always had a fondness for trucks, so I bought a camper in good condition for one. $5,000 and mounted it on my truck, intending to use it as temporary living quarters. What was meant to be a short-term fix ended up being a much longer stay than anticipated. Initially, I hoped to stay at my parents' house, where my sister and her family also lived. However, when I asked if I could park my camper there, my parents said their house was already full and they didn't want me there. Furthermore, we hadn't gotten along well in the past decade. They said they would only allow me to park my camper if I paid an amount equivalent to renting an apartment in the area, which was far too high just to park. Being jobless, I was trying to save as much of my unemployment benefits as possible until I could secure new employment. Paying that amount would have been as expensive as renting an apartment. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to leave since we couldn't reach an agreement. They found it amusing that I had to live in a camper, and my sister's husband joined them in mocking me, calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck camper in a store parking lot for the first night, with nowhere else to go. I felt terrified, thinking someone might break in, and I barely slept. With no other relatives nearby and my friends living in apartments, I didn't want to leave my area. I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment, which was the only way I could still receive my mail. Finding a stable place to park was a challenge. I spent months living a nomadic camper life while searching for a job similar to my old one. During this time, I faced many difficulties, from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding I move because they thought my camper was unsightly. At one point, someone claiming to represent a homeowners association HOA ordered me to move, even though I wasn't parked near any houses. When I questioned their authority, they became aggressive and threatened me. To avoid conflict, I relocated my camper. To keep my camper batteries charged, I used a long extension cord to plug into outside outlets of random buildings while parked on the street. I know it wasn't the most ethical solution, but I needed to keep my refrigerator running. I had a small solar power bank for my phone, but no generator, as they are noisy and require fuel. So, I did what I had to do to survive. After months of living this way, I finally found a new job in a neighboring city. I had to move there to avoid working in retail again, a promise I had made to myself during college. Despite still receiving unemployment benefits, I was restless and needed stability before the benefits ran out. With little to do but read, watch movies on a portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I could park and which local public bathrooms I could use, I found myself envying the Japanese for their public bathhouses. We could really use those here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse in old employee parking spaces. No one else bothered using the back parking spaces since they were so remote that they were nearly forgotten. The company owner, my boss, liked this setup because I was always ready to cover any shift, provided I got enough rest. He even allowed me to detach the camper from my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. While I'm not entirely sure if this arrangement was legal, no one questioned it during my entire stay there. Trespassers were rare, and the security guards promptly removed them when they did appear. I was essentially on call around the clock and worked almost every day. My boss let me connect my camper to the building's utilities for power and water, and in return, I paid a nominal rent by working for free on Sundays when the office was deserted, except for the janitor and the security guard. I had to shower at a friend's place or at the gym since my camper only had a portable toilet, which I avoided using because emptying it was a nasty task. I had a warehouse key and could access the bathroom there any time, becoming quite friendly with the night security guard. Heating the camper in winter was easy with a small electric heater, but summers were tough without air conditioning. I eventually bought a used portable AC unit to make it tolerable. I earned a lot of overtime pay and picked up new skills from my coworkers. Midway through the year, I was promoted to a supervisor position and received a better salary than my previous job. This change made me realize I needed a more permanent and stable living situation. The fear of losing my condo had shown me the importance of stability. I searched for a place near work and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home just 2 miles away. I managed to negotiate the price down by $10,000 from the asking price. I used almost all my savings for the down payment and secured a home loan, finally freeing myself from camper living. The new house had enough space behind it to park my truck and set up the camper as a separate little building in the backyard, ready for future use. Once settled, I naively posted about my new home on social media. My family saw the post, and that's when the trouble started. A few weeks later, my parents' and sister's family showed up unannounced to see my home. I hadn't given them my address, so how they found me remains a mystery. None of my friends admitted to telling them, and no family had visited before, leading me to suspect they might have followed me from work. They pushed their way in as soon as I opened the door, acting like they owned the place. They started snooping around, and my sister's husband kept giving me this smug grin. Later, I figured out why, and it made me furious. My parents kept commenting on how I had so much space for someone without a family, implying it was too much for me alone. My sister's husband kept noting that my house was bigger than my parents' and conveniently closer to his workplace. The warning signs were everywhere. Eventually, my sister's husband requested to speak with me alone. The rest of the family quickly exited the room and gathered on the front porch, which finally made me realize they had orchestrated something. Tom claimed that my house was far too large for a single person like me and suggested that he and his family move in, especially since his wife was expecting their 4th child. and my place was much closer to his workplace. He mentioned that I already had the camper, implying that I could live in it while they took over the house. Not once did he mention paying rent, despite his decent job. He started talking about how there would be changes, including setting curfews, and that I wouldn't be able to come in and out without giving notice. If it wasn't my sister's husband, I would think the person I was speaking to had lost touch with reality, but Tom had long been spoiled by our parents. Every time I tried to speak, he interrupted as though I had no voice in the matter. There was no way I would rent my house, especially not to him and his demanding wife. I had seen stories like this online and never imagined I would live through it because it seemed so outlandish. But my parents, sister, and Tom fit the mold of entitled individuals perfectly. I discreetly started recording with my phone. Tom didn't seem to notice and kept gesturing animatedly while listing all the reasons he needed my house, even extending his hand to seal the deal as if everything was already agreed upon. That's when I finally found my courage and firmly said, "No way." My loud response took Tom by surprise, causing him to step back. I rarely raised my voice to him because our parents would punish me, but this was my house, and I could assert myself here. Standing up, I told him that my house was off limits, and acting entitled wouldn't change that. I bought this house for myself, and it wasn't my fault he kept having more children and couldn't afford to move out of our parents' home. Tom got as close as he could without touching me, claiming I didn't deserve the house and that his family needed it more. I laughed and told him that was absurd because I worked hard to earn this house, so of course I deserved it. Tom started yelling that I had no family and didn't need all the space, so I should just give it to him. I pointed out that he never even offered to pay rent, expecting me to cover the entire mortgage while living in my own yard. Tom argued that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family was more important, and our parents had already decided I would do this for him, as if their decision was final. At this point, my parents and sister barged back in, surrounding me to try and pressure me into agreeing. The argument grew heated, with them repeatedly saying, "Just do it for Tom." I told them they had no control over my life or my house and demanded they leave before I called the police. My sister screamed the loudest, emphasizing her pregnancy and insisting I should comply for the sake of the family. She simply assumed she could keep taking from me, expecting I'd just go along with it. I owe nothing to her or her family. I then called her an arrogant snob who had never shown me any respect. I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I have no sympathy for her, and she will not be living in my house. Her face turned red with rage, and she lunged at me, landing a punch on my cheek before trying to hit me again. My sister's husband, Tom, had to physically restrain her as she kicked and screamed, demanding that he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. My phone was recording the entire scene. I held it up and warned them that I would call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents told Tom to get ready to leave, and my mother gave me a week to change my mind. I responded that I wouldn't be changing my decision and that they shouldn't come back. Turning to Tom's wife, I informed her that my phone had captured everything, and if she tried anything else, I would press charges for assault. She shrieked at me before storming out, crying loudly. My mother was the last to leave, insisting that I should do this for Tom and his wife. I told her bluntly that it wasn't happening. After kicking out my parents, sister, and Tom for trying to bully me into giving up my new house, I immediately went to social media to share the incident with my extended family. The story spread like wildfire, though you won't find it online anymore because I eventually deleted it and set my profile to private. I knew my family would try to twist the events to make me look like the bad guy, and I was right. But I had a head start and video evidence to back up my version of the story. This proactive move helped me gain the support of several family members. My parents, Tom and his wife, must have been ready to post their narrative, but it was too late. They didn't even bother trying to fabricate lies. They had a few supporters, but most of our relatives were already aware of their entitled behavior and quickly grasped the reality of the situation. One anonymous caller ranted at me, accusing me of being a terrible brother and saying I should make way for a real family man. I calmly ended the call and blocked the number, and thankfully, that was the end of such calls. A week later, as they had threatened, my parents and Tom showed up at my front porch. They rang the doorbell incessantly and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened the door just a crack, and they attempted to force their way in again. However, I had installed sturdy latch chains and braced myself against the door. My father and Tom demanded that I let them in, but I told them I was recording everything and would call the police if they tried to push their way in. My mother tried to calm them down and, in her most saccharine tone, asked if I was ready to let Tom move in. I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother began to cry theatrically and asked why I couldn't do this for Tom, claiming he was my beloved brother. I laughed and said bluntly, "I don't love him as a brother because he has treated me horribly for years, with your encouragement. You are terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother." I then demanded they leave immediately or I would call the police. To my surprise, they left relatively easily, except for my mother's loud sobbing and the others giving me dirty looks. It seemed almost too easy to get them to leave, making me wonder if they had something else planned. I thought the whole ordeal was over, but I should have been more vigilant because they had more outrageous plans. That Friday evening, I came home to find a moving truck and my sister's minivan parked in my driveway. Jessica and her family were moving their belongings into my house. She waved at me with a smug grin when she saw me, which only fueled my anger. I shouted at them to stop, but Jessica's husband, in his most condescending tone, said, like it or not, we're moving in, then added with a mocking pout, "It's okay because my mommy allowed it, and you should always listen to what your mommy tells you." Boiling with rage at his words and expression, I locked myself in my truck and called the police. When they realized what I was doing, Jessica's husband started pounding on my window and screaming at me to stop, insisting they needed the house. He even cried out, "Why can't you just do this for Jessica?" I retorted. "It's my house, not hers." He then threatened to scratch up my truck unless I stopped calling the police, a threat that the 911 operator overheard due to the slightly open window. I warned him that if he damaged my truck, I'd sue him. He was wise enough to back off. When the police arrived, Jessica, her husband, and their kids had locked themselves inside my house. I explained the situation to the officers, showing them my driver's license with my current address as proof. When we reached the front door, I saw they had changed the lock. The old lock lay on the porch, drilled out with the drill and a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set right next to it. I pointed out the broken lock and explained everything that had transpired. At some point after I had arrived home, Jessica must have called our parents because they showed up while I was talking to the police. My parents immediately started lying, claiming that I had agreed to rent my house to my sister and her family. I told them that was an easily disprovable lie. Jessica and her husband finally emerged from the house, looking overly confident and holding some papers. They had drawn up a fake rental agreement, but my signature was missing, and the one they had was an obvious forgery. None of them had ever seen my real signature, so it was a foolish attempt. I informed the officers that this was blatant fraud. If investigated, it would be clear as day. I warned my parents and Jessica that such actions could lead to severe consequences, including Jessica's husband losing his job, which was his only means of supporting his family. I also mentioned that I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I would contact CPS if necessary. Jessica's husband turned pale and looked genuinely frightened, but my mother interjected, doubling down on how I should just live in the camper so Jessica and her family could have the house. I yelled back that if she thought it was such a great idea, she should let Jessica have her house instead. The police had to separate us. I demanded they all leave immediately, or I would press charges. I stated loudly that they had drilled out my front door lock to break in. The rental agreement was a forgery, and I had recorded video of Jessica's husband attacking me. I reminded them these were felonies, and I could ruin their lives with them if they didn't comply. The police, understanding the severity of the situation, insisted that my sister and her family vacate the premises immediately. Reluctantly, they began to pack up their belongings, with my parents continuing to argue and plead with me. I stood my ground, watching them leave with a mix of relief and lingering anger. This ordeal had shown me just how far my family was willing to go to take advantage of me, and it was a hard lesson I would never forget. I wanted them out, and if they didn't leave, I'd call the authorities. The only reason I hadn't already called was for the sake of Jessica's children, giving them one last chance to leave. When my parents realized this, It finally dawned on them that they couldn't force me into doing this for Jessica. My mother finally relented and said she would put an end to this. She went over to Jessica and whispered to her for a moment while my father had a word with Jessica's husband. Suddenly, Jessica began to wail dramatically, tearing up the fake rental agreement into tiny pieces and throwing them like confetti, only to be sternly instructed by an officer to pick up the litter or face a fine. The cops had an expression that screamed, "This isn't worth my paycheck!" Jessica's husband reluctantly began telling the kids to put their belongings back into the moving truck. The children were all in tears, with the oldest one sobbing that he wouldn't get his own room. Jessica and her husband then orchestrated one final desperate attempt to guilt-trip me with their sad family act. It seemed rehearsed. The kids all donned identical pleading expressions with trembling lips. Jessica exaggeratedly rubbed her pregnant belly and tilted her head to appear pitiful, while her husband pulled a sad face, begging, "Please don't do this to us. We need this house." Unmoved, I told them to continue packing. Jessica, her husband, and the children ramped up their crying to a near-hysterical level, and Jessica's husband shouted, "Are you happy now you've denied us a home because you're too selfish to help your own family?" I laughed maniacally and responded, "What you're doing is stealing, not sharing, and no amount of tears will make me let your family move in. You're not my brother-in-law anymore. You're just an entitled jerk who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me, just like when we were kids." He started hurling curses at me until the police warned him to calm down, or he'd end up in handcuffs, regardless of my pressing charges. He clenched his teeth, looking both terrified and furious. I requested the officers to stay until my parents, Jessica, and her husband had left the premises. They assured me they wouldn't leave until everything was settled. Soon, 2 more officers arrived, doubling the police presence. This seemed to spur my parents into action. I demanded the keys to the new lock Jessica's husband had installed on my front door. He hesitated before spitefully throwing them down the street into a storm drain, telling me to fetch them myself. One of the officers reprimanded him and made him retrieve the keys. He had to remove the grate and got dirty in the process. When he finally handed over the keys, he did so grudgingly, slamming them into my hand. I reiterated my demand for them to leave and never return. My mother threatened to disown me as if that would intimidate me. I laughed and retorted, "Oh no, that means I won't have to endure any more holidays where you all treat me like crap anyway because Jessica has always been your favorite. You treated me so poorly growing up that if Jessica ever needed an organ donor, I wouldn't give her a thing. So do what you always told me to do when you mistreated me and suck it up." My parents were left speechless, and the police officers were visibly judgmental towards them. Confronting them in front of others who could see their true colors was incredibly satisfying. The cops' presence made it impossible for my parents to hide behind their usual facade, exposing them for what they truly were. My mother started crying and walked away, while my father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me. Jessica's husband held their kids in defeat, and Jessica was having a tantrum on my front lawn. Eventually, they all formed a line, passing boxes and loading their stuff back into the truck. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it all went out quickly. My mother kept trying to bargain with me, suggesting that Jessica could pay rent if they stayed, or that I could move back in with them and let Jessica rent my house. Each time I told her to shut up and keep packing. I didn't want Jessica or her family around, I didn't want their money, and I certainly didn't want to live with my parents ever again after how they treated me growing up. Jessica threw another tantrum upon hearing this, flinging a box to the ground and sitting down for a pity party. She didn't want to go back to living with my parents and sulked until everything was packed. When it was time to leave, she refused to get up. They finally got everything out and into the truck. Before they left, I gave my parents one last piece of my mind about all the abuse I endured growing up, with the cops standing right there. They couldn't do anything but stand there and take it for once. I called them out on their favoritism towards Jessica, how they let her and her husband ridicule me and call me a bum. Who's the bum now? You wanted to kick me out of my own house so Jessica could stay in it for free, yet when I needed a place, you wanted to charge me more than I could afford just to park my camper, knowing I was out of work. The officers looked increasingly judgmental. I asked my parents what I ever did to deserve being treated so badly other than being born. When I finally have a bit of success, you want to take it away for your favorite child. I bought my house with my own money. I owe you nothing, and I won't ask anything from you ever again, because I will never be more than a doormat or a cash cow in your eyes." They had no response, standing there like fish out of water. I continued, asking what made them think they were good parents. My father was red with embarrassment, and my mother cried, admitting she was a horrible person. I bluntly agreed, saying they were all terrible people who would go to hell for it. If I had confronted them in private, they would have gotten mad and acted like I was in the wrong. But now, with witnesses, they had to face the truth. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket, sobbing while my father just stood there, defeated. My father looked more defeated than I had ever seen him. Jessica and her family avoided making eye contact as they finished loading their belongings back into the moving truck. I ensured nothing of mine was taken, though I didn't have much furniture yet. They all got back into their vehicles, and Jessica stared at me with malice until her husband finally got her to drive the minivan home. As soon as they were gone, I went online and shared what had happened. This time, my parents were too embarrassed to defend themselves. The family, previously divided, now overwhelmingly supported me. Nearly everyone took my side, and those who didn't chose to remain neutral. The "we did it for Jessica" line no longer held any weight, and any remaining support for my parents evaporated. Many family members who had previously sided with my parents now supported me. I offered to host half the family for Christmas at my new house. Unsurprisingly, my parents were not invited. I wasn't blocked on Jessica and her husband's profiles, and I saw that Jessica had her fourth baby in early November. They were still living with my parents. Jessica kept making passive-aggressive posts about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if she could still guilt me. This situation was likely driving my mother and father crazy, having to endure 3 rowdy kids, a mentally unstable daughter-in-law, my golden child sister, and a newborn baby all under one roof. Perhaps they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Jessica take over their house completely. Maybe then they'd find some peace. For those suggesting I should have had my sister and her husband arrested, the only reason I didn't was because of their kids. If Jessica's husband were arrested, he'd likely lose his job, leaving his family with no income, and Jessica had just had a baby. But that didn't mean I couldn't get my revenge. I decided to wait until after the new year to share updates, just in case more happened. As expected, Jessica continued her passive-aggressive posts, especially after having her fourth baby. She complained about living with my parents, saying there wasn't enough space and that she needed her own house. It was the same repetitive nonsense, just rephrased. After what I'd been through, it was hard to feel anything but sarcastic about their plight. In January, I finally made an account and shared everything. I had invited half the family to a Christmas Eve party at my house, and despite the 3 to 4 hour drive, everyone came to show their support. They praised my hard work in getting a house on my own and apologized for everything I'd endured. Their support was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, I felt truly appreciated. We shared stories, laughed, and created new, positive memories. The stark contrast to the toxic environment I'd grown up in was a breath of fresh air. In the following weeks, Jessica's posts became more desperate. She kept lamenting their cramped living conditions, hoping to evoke pity, but I remained unfazed. They had their chance, and they blew it spectacularly. My parents and Jessica's husband were now stuck dealing with the chaos they tried to force onto me. Life moved on, and I focused on building a peaceful and happy home. I made it clear to my parents that I would no longer be their doormat. For once, I had control over my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me again. Reflecting on everything, I realized how much stronger I had become. This ordeal had tested me in unexpected ways, but it showed me the importance of standing up for myself. My home was my sanctuary, and I would protect it fiercely. My parents, Jessica, and her husband had to face the consequences of their actions, and there was no turning back. I had to admit, somewhat embarrassingly, I was very attached to living in Madison. The best job opportunities in my field were here, and Springfield didn't offer much, if anything, in that regard. I wanted to carve out my own path and prove my independence. They understood my reasoning, and we moved on to enjoying the party, the best it attended in 8 years. Relatives brought CDs with fantastic Christmas music, and my favorite was a Nat King Cole album my uncle brought. His rendition of Christmas songs was unparalleled. It was a joyous and carefree time, allowing me to forget my past troubles and savor the present. But of course, the peace didn't last. About 2 hours into the party, my parents, Jessica, and her husband barged in, all smiles without even knocking. I immediately turned off the music and told them to leave. They pleaded to stay, claiming they brought gifts. Before I could respond, my Uncle-me mother's own brother stood up and shouted at them. He declared they had no right to be in my home after what they tried to pull. Other relatives backed him up. My grandparents, despite their age, also stepped in and told my parents that if they wanted to reconcile with me, it was far too soon. They expressed their profound disappointment, stating that they had never been more ashamed of them than this past year. Their favoritism towards Jessica had been kept under wraps for a long time, but now it was blatantly obvious to everyone. My grandparents said they needed to make a genuine effort to treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be part of my life again. Turning to Jessica and her husband, they remarked that they were tired of the repetitive nonsense Jessica kept posting online, and that my house would never become their new home. Jessica resorted to her usual theatrics, crying and complaining about how unfair it was that I had this house to myself while she, with 3 kids, was cramped at my parents' place. She claimed she needed a better home to feel like a proper mother. Fed up, I pointed out loudly that she was a lousy mother, letting my mother handle most of the parenting while she wasted her days drinking, playing on her phone, or spending her husband's money. I even joked that her baby must be at risk of getting drunk from her breast milk, which drew shocked stares from the room. Jessica demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mother. I replied that the facts spoke for themselves. If she wanted to move out of my parents' house someday, she needed to use her college degree, get a job, and save money. With my mother already doing most of the childcare, Jessica would have plenty of time to work once her baby was a bit older. Her eldest child, who was 8 years old, then charged at me, kicking and screaming that I was the villain who made his mom cry and refused to let them live in my house. That's when Jessica's husband stepped in, trying to control the situation. Jessica's husband tried to pull their son away, but other relatives quickly intervened, turning the situation into a full-blown family intervention against Jessica and her husband. Jessica was in tears. Her baby was wailing. Her other kids were crying, and even her husband looked close to breaking down from the barrage of criticism. He ended up sitting on an ottoman by the front door, looking utterly defeated. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze and stayed silent, especially with a house full of angry relatives ready to call him out if he tried to assert himself. By now, he had been so thoroughly humiliated that his and my parents' reputation within the family was destroyed. Their facade had completely crumbled. Soon after, my parents, Jessica, and her husband left in defeat. The party continued, and we avoided discussing the incident for the rest of the evening. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night at my house. I even let some of them sleep in the camper, which made a cozy guest house. My relatives had been curious about it earlier and were amazed that I had lived in it for 2 years. They asked numerous questions about how I managed in different seasons and other details. On Christmas morning, I woke up early and made a fresh pot of coffee, along with ibuprofen for those nursing hangovers from the spiked eggnog. My guests complimented me on being a far better host than my parents ever were, and we all agreed to have a similar gathering next Christmas. After the holiday, Jessica finally stopped posting digs at me on social media and even deleted the old posts. However, shortly after the New Year, she made a new post complaining about how she had tried to convince my parents to buy a camper and set it up in their backyard so she and her family could have the whole house. My parents vehemently rejected the idea, unwilling to sacrifice their home or their comfort. The post was quickly taken down, and Jessica has hardly posted anything since. She realized there was no point in complaining when no one was listening anymore. Jessica's husband can't afford to move the family out on his salary alone, and if they end up having another child in the next few years, I won't be surprised. Since then, my life has settled down. I've started inviting friends over for poker nights, even though I'm terrible at poker and can never remember the rules. It doesn't matter, we enjoy drinking beer, eating junk food, and having a great time. We loaded up on Big Macs from McDonald's and had a blast, laughing and getting drunk. This summer, I'm considering dating again after all. I'm not getting any younger, so fingers crossed that it goes well. My camper now sits idle in the yard, but sometimes I go out there just to reminisce. After living in it for 2 years, it feels like a second home. Maybe one day I'll actually use it for its intended purpose, camping. I've never been camping before. My parents always dismissed it as a waste of time, so it would be a completely new experience for me.